Today, leadership and loyalty. Ulysses S. Grant and Cyclops of the XMen. Welcome back to Marvel America, the podcast where history meets heroism. Today we explored two leaders who carried the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. Ulysses S. Grant, the unshakable Union general who led the North to victory in the Civil War and later became the 18th President of the United States of America. And Cyclops, the steadfast leader of the X-Men, who bore the burden of guiding mutants in a world that feared and hated them. Both men were strategic visionaries, often underestimated in their youth. But through discipline and sheer willpower, they rose to command some of the most influential forces in history. They made tough choices for sure, inspired loyalty, and battled with their own personal demons while fighting for a greater cause. But at what cost? Were their sacrifices worth it? That's what we're here to explore. Let's get into it. Many have said Ulysses S. Grant was the reluctant hero who saved a nation. He comes from humble beginnings. Born in 1822 in Point Pleasant, Ohio, he grew up in a modest, working-class family. Unlike other famous generals, he was not from an aristocratic or military background. His parents were simple folks. His father a tanner, his mother deeply religious. He was a natural with horses. From a young age, Grant displayed an incredible ability with horses. He was quiet, observant, and had an almost instinctive understanding of animals. This would later translate into his calm, disciplined leadership style in battle. He attended West Point. Unremarkable there, but resilient. Grant wasn't a top student. In fact, he had a mediocre academic record at West Point, class of 1843. He ranked 21st out of 39 cadets. However, he excelled in mathematics and equestrian skills, which would later aid in his tactical thinking in cavalry command. Grant took part in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. He served under General Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. Under their command, Grant saw firsthand how war was fought on foreign soil. He witnessed the effectiveness of rapid, aggressive tactics, which shaped his own command style in the Civil War. After this war, Grant struggled with isolation, boredom, and drinking problems while stationed at remote forts. Eventually, he resigned from the Army in 1854, battling financial hardship and a growing dependence on alcohol, while working menial jobs just to survive. One of those jobs was selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis. When the Civil War erupts in 1861, Grant rejoined the Army, quickly rising through the ranks due to his decisive victories. Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, 1862, he secured the Union's first major victories and earned the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. The Battle of Shiloh, 1862. This was a brutal and bloody engagement, but Grant refused to retreat, proving his resilience. The Vicksburg Campaign, 1863, a masterclass in siege warfare, splitting the Confederacy in half. The Overland Campaign, 1864 to 65. He was relentless, and the war was too. Then there's the rivalry, the Overland Campaign, 1864 to 1865. The relentless war of attrition against Robert E. Lee. Grant knew he could afford the losses. The South could not. Lee eventually surrenders to Grant, ending the Civil War in 1865. 4 years later, Grant was elected the 18th President of the United States. He fought for civil rights, cracked down on the KKK, and rebuilt the nation. There were financial scandals. Loyal to a fault, Grant's trust in corrupt advisors damaged his presidency. His final battle, diagnosed with throat cancer in 1884, he raced against time to finish his memoirs, writing one of the greatest military autobiographies of all time before passing in 1885. Arguably the X-Men's greatest leader, Cyclops. He first appeared in X-Men #1 back in 1963, created by none other than Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Scott Summers lost his parents in a plane crash, developing uncontrollable optic blasts. Raised in an orphanage, then recruited by Professor X to be the first X-Men. Because I grew up a huge comic fan, allow me to give you some recommendations. X-Men number 1 to 66, 1963 to 1970. This displays Scott Summers' early leadership. He led the original team while struggling with responsibility at a young age. The Dark Phoenix Saga, Uncanny X-Men number 129 to 138. This is back in 1980. His love for Jean Grey shattered when she became the Dark Phoenix, a storyline that made it to the big screen with 20th Century Fox. And when I first got into comic books, one of my favorite storylines was the Mutant Massacre. This was from Uncanny X-Men number 210 to 213 back in 1986. This was the first time Cyclops questioned Xavier's ideals after witnessing mass slaughter. And then in 2012, we get the famous Avengers versus the X-Men. This was a limited series, number 1 through 12. Scott Summers takes control of the Phoenix Force, accidentally killed Professor X, and became a fugitive. And check out these in 2019. We had House of X and Powers of X. This was actually a single interconnected storyline told across 2 interwoven miniseries, and they were written by Jonathan Hickman. It served as a major reboot to the X-Men universe and redefined mutant history, politics, and their future. How this storyline completely transformed the X-Men's status quo. It made them a global superpower rather than an oppressed minority. As is the case with all heroes, they got their strengths and their flaws. And of course, when you got a heavy burden of leadership, you're going to make some errors throughout the years. We know that Grant's strengths were numerous. He was a brilliant strategist, master of siege and attrition warfare. He had unshakable resilience. No matter the hardship, he pressed on. Let's dive into Grant's flaws a bit, because ultimately it's flaws that really shape and often determine the great person we become. Leadership isn't for the faint of heart, and both Grant and Cyclops carried the heavy weight of responsibility on their shoulders. While they rose to greatness, their flaws weren't just obstacles. They were direct products of their upbringing, experiences, and the pressures placed upon them. As I mentioned, Grant struggled with alcoholism. His drinking problem didn't come from nowhere. He was a West Point grad and a man of discipline, but his early career was full of setbacks. In the 1850s, he struggled with civilian life, failing as a farmer, a businessman, and even a bill collector. When he was stationed at a remote military outpost, he was cut off from his family. Loneliness and disappointment pushed him toward alcoholism. The rumors of his drinking nearly derailed his career, forcing him to resign from the military at one point. But here's the kicker. Grant was able to control his drinking, as many cannot, when he had a mission. During the Civil War, when he was locked into battle, he didn't have time for alcohol. His drinking resurfaced in moments of boredom and inactivity. A testament to the fact that leaders often struggle when they aren't fighting for something greater than themselves. I'm sure many of us can relate to this. I know as a teacher, I've had students, when they're idle, when they don't have something they're pushing for, they tend to act out. Whereas those students who are engaged in activities like sports or clubs, or have some sort of a higher purpose, whether it's just their studies, knowing that they're striving for something more, college, a career, and down the road a family. And if the kids are really astute and really looking long term, they're already thinking about philanthropy. It is said that Grant was loyal to a fault, and that worked on the battlefield, where trust in your subordinates is key. But politics, whole different battlefield. As president, he carried the same military mindset, assuming that people around him, especially those he considered friends, were honorable and honest. This backfires big time. Corrupt officials in his administration took advantage of his loyalty, leading to major scandals like the Whiskey Ring and the Credit Mobile scandal. The Whiskey Ring scandal this was back in 1875, is a massive tax evasion scheme where government officials and distillers conspire to avoid paying the whiskey taxes. Instead of collecting millions in excess taxes, corrupt officials pocketed the money while underreporting sales. The scandal involved Grant's inner circle, including his personal secretary, Orville Babcock. Grant publicly supported the investigation but attempted to shield Babcock, raising concerns about his judgment. Ultimately, more than 100 officials were indicted, but Grant's reputation suffered due to his blind loyalty to corrupt subordinates. And in the Credit Mobilier scandal, this was from 1872 to 1873, a fraudulent scheme involving the Union Pacific Railroad and a fake construction company called Credit Mobilier of America. Union Pacific execs created Credit Mobilier to overcharge for railroad construction, essentially paying themselves with federal funds. To cover up the fraud, Credit Mobilier bribed congressmen, including Vice President Colfax, with discounted stock to keep them quiet. When the scandal broke, many politicians were exposed, further eroding public trust in government. Though Grant wasn't personally involved, the scandal added to the perception that his administration was riddled with corruption. Grant believed in total war. He saw the bigger picture, victory at any cost. But that led to brutal high-casualty battles like Cold Harbor, where 7,000 Union soldiers fell in under an hour. He wasn't reckless. He was pragmatic. He knew the Union had more resources than the Confederacy, and he was willing to grind the enemy down, even if it meant heavy losses. This made him controversial, of course. Some saw him as a butcher, others as the man who ended the war when no one else could. And Cyclops, too, as a leader, has always had a big weight on his shoulders. Over the years, he's been tactically brilliant, one of Marvel's best battlefield leaders, resilient under pressure. He survived Jean Grey's death, Xavier's death, in exile. But just like Grant, Cyclops, as a leader, made the tough calls, and just like Grant, his flaws came from the very traits that made him great. Cyclops had to grow up too fast. As a child, he and his brother were in a plane crash, as I mentioned, and Scott had to watch his parents die before his very eyes. He spent years in an orphanage, struggling with his mutant powers, unable to control his optic blasts. When Charles Xavier took him in, he was taught discipline above all else, that his emotions needed to be controlled so he wouldn't hurt others. The result? Cyclops became emotionally shut off, afraid of letting people get too close, because deep down, he believed that his power made him dangerous. By the way, for those of you who may not be familiar with Cyclops' powers, he has the ability to emit powerful optic blasts from his eyes. These beams of concussive force can knock back, injure, or even disintegrate objects, but they do not generate heat like lasers. Because he cannot control his powers, he's got to wear a ruby quartz visor or glasses, which filter and contain the blasts. Without them, his optic beams would fire uncontrollably. His power is fueled by solar energy, meaning his strength doesn't run out as long as he absorbs sunlight. Cyclops always believed in Xavier's dream of mutant equality, but over time, that idealism hardened into something else. After experiencing genocide, leveled threats against mutants, he realized that playing nice wasn't always going to save his people. He became more militant, making morally gray decisions like preemptive attacks and working with villains to protect mutants. His ultimate turning point? Avengers vs. the X-Men, where he went so far as to kill Professor X under the influence of the Phoenix Force. At that moment, he crossed the line. He became the very extremist he once fought against. Cyclops went from being Xavier's golden boy to being viewed as a mutant terrorist. He embraced this role, believing that if he had to be hated to protect his people, so be it. Much like Grant, who was seen as a butcher, but did what he had to do to win the war, Cyclops took the burden of leadership even when it meant being despised. When we compare the two figures, both Grant and Cyclops are leaders who were shaped by hardship. Both struggled with trust, whether in their officials, in Grant's case, or in their emotions, in the case of Cyclops. Both made brutal decisions, whether on the battlefield, Grant, or for mutant survival, Cyclops. And both, despite their flaws, stood firm in their convictions, even when the world turned against them. Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about making the hard choices, and sometimes those choices come with a heavy price. What do you guys think? Were their sacrifices worth it? Did their flaws cost too much? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep that discussion going. Let's burst that American bubble. We got to understand, as Americans, we're not the center of the universe. Other things were going around the world during the Civil War. For instance, 1861, Italy is unified. Italy officially became one nation under King Victor Emmanuel II. Britain and France were industrializing rapidly. The Civil War disrupted cotton imports, forcing European textile industries to adapt. This was Japan's last samurai era. The Tokugawa shogunate was losing power. The Mexican Civil War is going on, and the French intervene. This is roughly 1861 to 1867. Mexico was in turmoil as President Benito Juarez suspended debt payments to European powers. In response, France invaded Mexico in 1862, installing Austrian Archduke Maximilian I as emperor. This is where Cinco de Mayo comes from. Mexican forces defeated the French at the Battle of Puebla in 1862, but France occupied Mexico City a year later. There was the Taiping Rebellion in China, 1850 to 1864, one of the deadliest conflicts in world history. The Taiping Rebellion, led by Hong Xiaotran, my apologies if I didn't nail that pronunciation, he was a man who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus and sought to overthrow the ruling Qing dynasty. By the time the rebellion was crushed in 1864, 20 to 30 million people were dead, more than the Civil War, World War I, and the Napoleonic Wars combined. The Second Opium War from 1856 to 1860. Though it ended just before the Civil War, its effects were still being felt. Britain and France forced China into humiliating treaties, opening ports for trade and legalizing opium sales, worsening China's social problems. The Chinese emperor was forced to accept Western dominance, fueling resentment that would last for decades. We have the Bismarck Rising in Germany, 1862. Otto von Bismarck became prime minister in Prussia in 1862 and immediately began maneuvering to unify Germany under Prussian rule. He delivered his famous Blood and Iron speech, setting the stage for a series of wars that would unite Germany in 1871. Russia and serfdom in 1861. While America is fighting over slavery, Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom in Russia, freeing 23 million peasants from legal bondage. This was Russia's version of the Emancipation Proclamation, though serfs still struggle under oppressive economic conditions. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, Britain officially took control of India in 1858, dissolving the Mughal Empire. By the 1860s, India was Britain's crown jewel, with railroads, telegraphs, and tea plantations expanding rapidly under British rule. Let's get into pop culture so you can picture what it might have been like to live back then, or get a better idea. Music. Popular songs included, ever heard of it? Battle Hymn of the Republic and Dixie. In literature, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was banned in the South, but hugely influential. In theater, the beloved Shakespeare plays were commonly performed, especially Macbeth and Julius Caesar. The birth of American pulp fiction came in the form of dime novels. Cheap, mass-produced dime novels exploded in popularity, especially among soldiers. These books featured Western adventures, war heroes, and detective stories, giving readers an escape from the harsh realities of war. One of the first American action heroes? Buffalo Bill Cody. became famous through dime novels. The minstrel shows were, of course, controversial entertainment. It was a form of stage entertainment featuring exaggerated racial stereotypes, often performed by white actors in blackface. That's why there's such a stigma attached to that to this day. They were hugely popular in both the North and the South. These shows reinforced racist tropes, but also helped spread early American folk music across the country. One of the biggest songs of the era, the aforementioned Dixie. This originated in minstrel performances before becoming the South's unofficial anthem. The harmonica became one of the most popular instruments among soldiers because it was small, portable, and easy to play around campfires. Fiddles and banjos were also widely played, keeping morale up with folk tunes and drinking songs. Both Union and Confederate soldiers sang parody songs, mocking each other, often to the tune of well-known melodies. Poetry and letters back then. The Civil War era saw an explosion of poetry, much of it written by soldiers and civilians capturing the emotions of war. Walt Whitman, one of America's greatest poets, wrote Drum Taps, 1865, a collection of poems about the war's brutality and impact on the soul. Letter writing became essential as soldiers exchanged heartfelt letters with loved ones, many of which survive today, giving us a first-hand insight into their experiences and the fact that they were a lot more well-read than many of us are today. Newspapers became the main source of war news, and political cartoons became a major form of satire and propaganda. Cartoonists like Thomas Nast used humor and art to criticize Confederates, corrupt politicians, and even Abraham Lincoln's leadership. These cartoons helped shape public opinion and influence voters during elections. It's on. You set for the trivia challenge? I'm going to give you 10 trivia questions, and you're going to think about the answers, and then I'm going to read the questions again with the answers, and you'll determine how you did. Number 1. Who did Grant defeat to end the Civil War? What is Cyclops' real name? And in the 20th Century Fox X-Men movies, what was the name of the actor who played Cyclops in the original trilogy? What personal struggle nearly ended Grant's career? What team did Cyclops help found? You better get this one. What was Grant's biggest military victory? Who did Cyclops kill while under the influence of the Phoenix Force? What major civil rights achievement happened during Grant's presidency? What item does Cyclops wear to control his powers? Before becoming a general, Grant struggled financially and had to take on what unusual job to support his family? In what famous comic book storyline did Cyclops merge with Apocalypse, altering his moral compass and making him one of the most dangerous mutants? How do you think you did? Here's the first one. Who did Grant defeat to end the Civil War? Robert E. Lee. What was Cyclops' real name? Scott Summers. And in the 20th Century Fox X-Men movies, who was the actor who played Cyclops? James Marsden. What personal struggle nearly ended Grant's career? Alcoholism. What team did Cyclops help found? The X-Men. What was Grant's biggest military victory? The Siege of Vicksburg. Who did Cyclops kill while under the influence of the Phoenix Force? Professor X. What major civil rights achievement happened during Grant's presidency? The 15th Amendment, securing black men's voting rights. What item does Cyclops wear to control his powers? A ruby quartz visor. He's also got special sunglasses too. Before becoming a general, Grant struggled financially and had to take on what unusual job to support his family? Selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis. In what famous comic book storyline did Cyclops merge with Apocalypse, altering his moral compass and making him one of the most dangerous mutants? The 12, a storyline in X-Men number 97 to 100. This is back in 1999 to 2000, where Cyclops merged with Apocalypse. And now one of my favorite segments, I hope you enjoy this challenge as well. The Socratic questions. As a general, Grant had to choose between prolonged defensive strategies with fewer casualties or aggressive offensive that led to massive loss of life, which he ended up doing. If you were in his position, would you have sacrificed thousands of men to bring the war to a quicker end, or taken a slower approach, possibly prolonging the suffering? And if you were Cyclops, and you knew Professor X's peaceful dream was failing, would you abandon it and embrace Magneto's militant vision for mutant survival, even if it meant becoming the villain in human eyes? This mirrors real life. Think about those who followed Martin Luther King and may have gotten discouraged. And then there's Malcolm X. He didn't always follow the peaceful methods that Martin Luther King did. There you go. Have fun wrestling with those. Now, your closing call to action. Grant and Cyclops remind us that leadership is about loyalty, resilience, and making hard choices. How do you lead in your own life? Do you or do you shy away from leadership? Let me know in the comments. Leave a review and join me next time for another deep dive into history and heroism. I love you.